US fans!
It's the Agents of Beastgrave.
And welcome to another look at Warhammer Underworlds, how it works, sort of tutorial, educational videos on how the game works.
Yes.
Today we're talking about
Cards.
Possibly the second most important thing after your fighters. I would say.
Possibly.
Your fighters,
yeah.
without you basically can't play the game without either.
No,
Probably
you need
equally
both.
important. You
And
have to have your
maybe some
objectives,
dice.
and these guys, your objectives are what you're working to, and the power cards are what makes your fighters better and help you work towards your goals.
Yes. So we're going to cover each of the different types off to try and give you a quick example of them and what they do and what they mean, and hopefully cover all the main scenarios they're in.
Yep, and maybe talk a little bit about how you might build a deck, but only in very general terms, because that's a very, very specific topic, which will come in a much later video, I think. I mean, all I was really going to say was when you're putting your deck together and looking at your cards, you probably want to start with your objectives so you know what you're working towards.
Yes, and then you can pick ploys up that will help you work towards those objectives.
Yep.
So talking of objectives, we'll start with objectives.
Great segue, Pete. Great segue.
I love it. I love it when it works like that. So your objectives generally are fulfill this criteria and get some glory. And most of the time, you'll see how many glory are on the card, as we covered in the previous video. And generally, you score that at the end of a round, where you say, "Have I made 4 attacks? Yes, I have. Therefore, I can score Keep Chopping," for example.
Absolutely. And the more glory that they score, normally the harder they are to score.
Yes. Now, there are some situations where you can score your objectives outside of that end phase. One of those examples is a Surge card.
Yeah, we covered those in the earlier video about objectives, but yes, you can have surge cards, and there are various points in the game where you can surge those. But again, it's the same thing. If you fulfill a condition that is on the card, you score it. Only the difference with surges, you do it at the point at which you fulfill it. Whereas, so a surge objective might be when you take a fighter out of action, get some get a glory.
Yes.
Or there might be one which is in an end phase, if you took somebody out of action in the previous round, gain a glory. So they're kind of the same thing, just the timing's different.
Yes. It is worth pointing out the surge cards do always get scored last in the sequence, where there might be reactions floating around. So, as an example, calculated risk you will score if you run through a lethal hex or make a move through a lethal hex. Now, you might also have a fighter that inspires for taking damage. In the case of Oryx, let's say you move through a lethal hex with that Auric, he will move through it, he'll take a damage. At the end of that activation, that movement, he will then inspire, and he might gain more wounds.
Absolutely. If he's charging, it's at the end of the super action. So
Yes.
he wouldn't inspire, he doesn't get the better attack until he's attacked, it finishes, then you can play reactions. So he then inspires, then you can play reactions, and then he... you get the glory. You score the glory for the objective.
And then he scores
so
calculated risk.
It's right at the end. You get the glory for the calculated risk. We often say, I'm going to take it, put the card in the discard pile, the glory, because we forget.
Just because you forget otherwise. Now, it is important, if you do that, you don't draw your new card at that point, because you don't pick a new card up when you score a surge until after it's been scored.
That's probably worth iterating here. You cannot score a surge card, pick one up, find it's a surge card, discover you've already met the criteria, and put it down. You have to wait until you've activated again, or to the end of the next activation if it's one of those. And if you've still fulfilled the criteria, in most cases you can then score it.
A couple of good examples is Scrum or Temporary Victory. You might make a move through a lethal hex, take a wound, and then score calculated risk. You might then draw Scrum and realise you have 4 people altogether, or you might draw up Temporary Victory, which you might already be standing on 3 objectives, but you can't score that one until after your opponent's activation, because they may do something to knock you off one of those objectives or to break up that group of 4 people.
It's also worth bearing in mind that the surge objective might be something like kill 2 fighters. If you've just charged through a lethal hex, killed the second fighter, so you score calculated risk, discard it, pick up a new card that says kill 2 fighters. It scores immediately when you've killed 2 or more fighters. You have to kill another fighter before you score it. You can't in the next round say, well, I killed 2 fighters earlier and score it. But there are shades of grey, and some of the wording, that depends on the wording, but generally speaking, you can't score surge objectives after you pick them up if you haven't fulfilled the conditions.
You definitely can't score them after immediately picking them up, and
definitely.
sometimes you can't score them in the next round until you then refill that criteria.
Yeah, and as you can see for how long we've talked about it, surge objectives can get a little bit complicated, but actually when you read the card, they are most...
Usually they're self-explanatory.
95%, they are 95% of the time self-explanatory.
Yes, you might have a card that says 2 or more enemy fighters are out of action, score immediately. And in that situation, you might kill someone and then pick that card up. And in the next round, you will score it because 2 or more people are out of action. However, the card might say kill your second or subsequent fighter and then you won't score it until you kill someone, because you have to kill someone to trigger it.
That's what I was trying to say, Pete. So they're much more succinctly.
Another type of objective card are hybrids. Now, these are new to Beastgrave, and they're quite funky. They give you more than one way to score an objective, but you don't have to fulfil all the criteria.
No, they're quite nice. They can be, and sometimes they can have very diametrically opposed criteria, which is quite nice. I think there's one to do with standing on objectives and or killing lots of people. So
Yes.
it's kind of like two different ways to play towards the same objective, which is quite neat.
Yes, if you've got a best of 3 game going on, your opponent knows you've got this objective, which is stand on 3 objectives. However, that card might be a hybrid, and it might also say stand on 3 objectives or kill a fighter with 4 wounds. Now, your opponent might remember, okay, I want to keep him off objectives next time round, and he may do that, but that's not going to stop you killing one of his 4 wound fighters, and you can score it that way as well.
They're almost like having a free optional upgrade objective in your hand.
It is, yeah.
It gives you a bit more flexibility. So they're a nice addition to the game, I think.
Generally, the rewards are slightly less for the things you have to pull off, but that's because you have more ways of doing them.
Exactly. Slightly less flexible are the dual cards, DUAL, not dual as in fighting, where they have 2 conditions and you have to meet them both.
Yes.
An example of this would be Chosen Warriors, which is a Nurgle Wormspat specific card. And it says, Pete?
Now, this has 2 criteria on it. One of them is that you have a surviving friendly fighter, and the other is that you have 3 dead enemy fighters. So you can score it once both of those criteria have been met.
But you can't score it if, for example, you've managed to kill most of your opponent's warband, but they've killed all of yours.
Yeah.
You can't score it because you can only fulfil one of the conditions.
Yes, or if all of your guys are on the board and all your opponents are still on the board, then no one's dead, so you still haven't scored it.
Yeah, and so Duel is another new addition after Beastgrave, and again, it just gives a little bit of flavour, I suppose, to the objective. It's not all the same. Doing
It's
the same
not
thing
all
the
end
time.
phase or all immediate.
Yeah.
The last thing to remember is also, as well as end phase cards, there are 3rd end phase cards as well.
Yeah. So there are 5 types of objective. There are Surge, there are Duel, there are Hybrid, there are End Phase, and there are 3rd End Phase. At the moment, at the time of speaking in Beastgrave, that's where we're at, and it's all very jolly exciting.
And you can get Surge hybrid cards.
Yeah.
We haven't seen any others as yet, but there might be Surge dual cards and stuff like that as well coming
Don't
around.
think you'll get a Surge 3rd End Phase.
Probably not. So those are the objective cards done and out of the way. And then we're going to move on to your power cards.
Power cards.
Power cards get split into both gambits and upgrades, and gambits get split further into both ploys and spells. So you have gambit ploys, gambit spells, and upgrades. And to start with, we're going to start looking at the gambit ploys.
Gambit ploys. These I always feel like are the bread and butter of your deck. These are the one. They're the hardest, always the hardest to whittle down.
Yeah.
And you want to take 20 of them, and you can normally only take sort of 10. You have to have at least 10 upgrades, and you have to have the same amount or less of gambits. Gambits.
Yes, and it's important to remind you have to have at least 20 cards overall as well.
Yeah.
You can't have 10 upgrades and 9 power cards.
No.
So we're going to start with our ploys, and ploys are generally fairly straightforward things to use.
Pretty much, yeah. They're normally played during the power step,
Yep.
because you can't play them in the end phase.
No.
And they're normally like give your next attack action in the next activation +1 dice, or something like that.
Or it might be discard 1 card and pick up some more cards.
Yeah, that's quite common ones. A really popular one is distraction, which is push one of your enemy fighters 1 space. So they're kind of used for extra little bits of control around the board game. They kind of make you a bit more accurate. They move the fighters where you want them to go. And they are, but that's why they're so useful, because they give you a bit of control back.
Some of them are a bit more specific, and there might be reaction cards, and it'll say so on the card if they are. It'll say reaction, and then it'll give you the example in which they can be used, and it might say something like, play this card when your opponent picks up a power card, or it might be, play this card when your opponent makes a move action, or something like that.
Yeah, and they break the normal sequence of play. We've talked a number of videos about where the sequence of play is, but they break into it. So you might be reacting immediately to, if it's in the power step, they might be reacting immediately to your opponent playing a ploy, which means you can play one, but then on the next, because you take turns, it would still be your turn next. That isn't because it's a reaction, it's not your turn in the power step, it is actually, you've broken that. Or it might be in the middle of an attack action, you play it, and that just temporarily stops it. You play it, you resolve it, and then you carry on with wherever you were in the game.
Exactly. Now, the other kind of gambit is the spell, and these are specific to casters only. Not all warbands have casters, and only people who are casters can use these cards.
And it's worth pointing out that once your caster is dead, your spell cards therefore are completely useless because only spellcasters can utilise them.
Yes.
So it does make which is most of them, all of the magic warbands with only one magic user. It does give you a bit of frailty in there because if your magic user dies, those cards are useless. And those gambit spots are useful because every ploy counts. Every ploy counts. If you have to throw them away because they're no use, it's terrible and it bricks up your hand.
Yes.
So it is something to consider. We haven't actually covered how magic works in this instance. We've talked in our attack action video. We talked about how spell attacks work, and these kind of work in the same way, except they're actually normally a little bit easier to cast.
Yes.
Because there's no defense roll. There's no defending against spells. That's kind of a thing you probably need to say. Unless it says specifically in the description, a spell pretty much just works. If you cast it, it works.
Yes. It's not like spell attacks, which are like normal attacks where your opponent can roll defense dice. You pretty much just have to meet the criteria on the card. So you have an example. You've got a spell. Let's say it's called Segat Salvo. Now that will give you immediately a little couple of symbols on the card, and that will tell you what you need to roll to cast it. In the case of Segat Salvo, you can see 2 lightnings. So you have to roll 2 or more dice depending on your wizard's level, and it is dependent on your wizard's level, remember, based on their character card. You then have to roll 2 lightnings.
Yeah, so in this case, if we have Fecula, for example, she's a level 2 wizard. She rolls 2 spell dice. She can cast this spell, and she'd have to roll 2 channels, 2 lightnings on her dice. If it was, say, Amis from the Cursebreakers warband, she's only a level 1 wizard, so she has no chance without any additional help of casting this spell because the most she can roll is 1 channel. And even if you roll a crit in this case, it's not like combat where it's extra. If you roll a crit, it's still only 1 success.
Yes.
It doesn't. You don't roll a crit and be able to cast any spell you want. You would need a crit and a channel. It is worth pointing out that crits are still successes.
Yes. If you roll 2 crits, you would still cast Segat Salvo because the 2 crits are 2 successes and will count as 2 lightnings. You would also take a damage from backlash in this situation.
As described in the combat video, the attack action video is exactly the same. Yes. Multiple crits cause damage, but it's only 1 damage no matter how many crits you roll.
The benefit of spells is, of course, you can use those in your power step after having already cast a spell attack action in your activation. So you might be able to get multiple damage off of somebody with multiple different cards or dice rolls, which is something you can't do with regular attackers for the most part.
No, and there is, we will probably cover this in upgrades too, but it is worth mentioning that there are some upgrades which have spell reactions on them. So there might be, so you could play one of those in one of your fighter, and there might be circumstances within the game that break up the sequence, as we've discussed, that enables you to react with a spell, which is another way of casting spells. And there are objectives which enable you to score glory for casting multiple spells, and these kind of cards are really useful for that.
It is also worth pointing out that if you are a level 1 wizard, you can attempt to cast a Segat Salvo, but you are always going to fail it. But sometimes maybe you actually want to just try and cast a spell to fail to create some kind of reaction window for yourself.
Yeah, there are circumstances where you can choose spells that are going to have no effect, but it does depend on the wording. So, for example, you can cast a healing spell even though you've got nobody to heal because just because you want to cast the spells, the spell goes off, but nobody heals any wounds. But you do have to check the wording. Do check the FAQ because there are some spells that you're not allowed to do that with, and it is specific. Because the classic one was Cursebreakers. They were FAQ because they have their own innate spell on their fighter card, which is Empower, and they have ruled that you can now only cast that once, and once it's cast, you can't keep doing it because people are using it to generate some high glory spell cards, which is to know about, but they've spammed it. So do just check. Sorry, they've stopped you from spamming it, so do just check the FAQ about a specific card interaction if you're not sure.
Yes, things like Vital Surge is a spell which says you can remove up to 2 wounds from a fighter. Therefore, if you cast it but nobody has any wounds on them, that's okay because you can remove up to, and that includes 0.
Yes.
It also goes without saying that whenever you use a ploy or a gambit spell, you then discard it. You can't keep hold of it, you can't reuse it, it is gone.
Absolutely, yeah, they discard any card like that, you discard it. It is worth saying that for ploys as well, if it does say up to, then you don't have to do it. Yes. So the classic one is 2 steps forward, which I think people get a little bit confused by. 2 steps forward is a card where you are able to push 2 of your own fighters. I think they are. I think you do have to push 2. I think you do have to push 2. You can't only push 1. You have to push 2. But your opponent can push somebody up to 1.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to. Because there are circumstances where forcing your opponent to push somebody, it will be a disadvantage to them, and that card is designed that way. So do check out for up to means you don't have to do it. But if it just says push 1, you do have to do it.
So those are the ploys, gambits, gambit spells and ploys, and then the last thing in our list are upgrades.
Upgrades.
Now, upgrades are incredibly useful most of the time, but you do need glory to get them. Once you have a glory, you can spend that glory by turning it over, and then you can put an upgrade onto a fighter.
Yes, upgrades, you have to be careful. They can brick up your hand, because if you're not generating glory, you can't use them. And so they are, certainly early in the game, you want, ideally in your hand, you want more ploys, gambits than upgrades. But they come in different flavours. There's some very standard ones. I think the most chosen upgrade of all is great strength. It's a simple addition to the strength of your fighter, which means they do additional damage. So you've got your damage characteristic on your fighter. So Fecula, I think, normally does 2 damage.
Yep.
But great strength will add +1 damage for her range 1 or 2 attack. It doesn't do anything for range 3, but it would give her +1. And there's lots of things like that. There's great speed, which does +1 movement. There's great fortitude, which does +1 wounds. And they're kind of like your simple bread and butter upgrades.
And any upgrade that modifies the stat of something modifies the base stat. And that may seem obvious, but some bits later on may say a damage characteristic of 2 or greater does something.
Yeah.
Your fighter might have a damage characteristic of 1, but you apply great strength to him, the base characteristic now becomes 2. So it is altering the base stat, and you do use that final calculated value when looking at any other rules that say to reference things like the damage characteristic.
There are ploys that work against fighters which have wounds of 4 or more, and if you put a +1 wound on a fighter of 3, even though their base stat is 3, they are considered to have 4 wounds now.
Yeah.
And those type of cards that work on 4 wounds or above would trigger for that fighter.
Yep.
There are upgrade attack actions. These can be really useful. So they are particularly they've had, over the years they've had shade glass weapons and nullstone weapons and amber glass weapons, which is a whole slew of weapons, all based around that theme.
Mutating weapons.
One for each season. And Pete loves the mutating maul, and they are quite often very good upgrades for your weaker fighters, because they're really strong, solid upgrades which can do serious damage, which the weaker fighters wouldn't normally be able to do. They normally have a downside. You can normally only use them once before you have to discard them, but they are very useful and very popular in amongst the meta. I probably should explain what meta is one day, but there's lots of articles on meta. Yeah, and Pete loves the mutating maul, which is another great upgrade. And that's another example of a weapon upgrade. There are certain fighters that can't have weapon upgrades. Normally they have 4 legs.
Yes, normally they're like a cat or a dog or something like that. You say they have 4 legs, but Skaith the Huntsman's got 4 legs, and he can take weapon upgrades, but that's because he's got 2 arms as well.
That's true, yes.
There are also, along with weapon upgrades and stat upgrades, there are some upgrades that give you access to spells, such as IR's Instant Shield. Now this is special for 2 reasons, because it's a spell, but also it's a reaction. So it's an upgrade that once you play it gives you a specific reaction to be able to use in certain situations, such as being attacked, and it enables you to then try and cast a spell on top of that.
Yes, quite nice. Reaction upgrades, generally, even if they're not spell related, are nice.
Yep.
Obviously, the spell ones are restricted only to your spellcaster, so you can't put it on one of your fighters who isn't a wizard. It's worth bearing in mind. And there are a few upgrades which are restricted. Normally, in any one warband, the leader will get a couple of upgrades that only they can have, because they're like the boss and they get all the good stuff.
Also, on the top of that, there are some cards, and they're even rarer, but they have a leader symbol on them, and those can only be played to leaders. There is no restriction on how many upgrades you place on a fighter. You might put all 10 or 12 or 14 of your upgrades on one fighter. It's a bit of an all eggs in one basket situation, but there is no maximum.
No, you can do that. You can play as many as you like, as long as you've got the glory. You can play as many as you like on whoever you like, pretty much. You can't put upgrades on dead fighters. There are some warbands that can bring back fighters when they're dead, but you cannot attach an upgrade to them while they're dead with the hope of bringing them back with it. That's not allowed. But if they do die and they have got upgrades on them, and you are one of those warbands where you can bring people back, the upgrades do stay on them. So that can be really useful. If you've got somebody like the Skaven, they can bring somebody back on any starting hex. If you lose somebody when they've got a couple of decent upgrades on them, you can then bring them back in a really advantageous position. So that is a definite tactic that people who play Skaven do use a lot.
Yes, definitely. And that is the basics of the cards in the game. As we covered, upgrades, ploys, gambit spells, and upgrades, and all the little extras that they come.
It is worth mentioning, if you are going to play in Championship play, as we've stated before, only the current 2 seasons live can be used, and Games Workshop regularly update cards on their Forsaken and restricted list, and you're only, at the moment as things stand, you're only allowed 3 cards that are restricted, and you can't have any of the Forsaken ones because they've been Forsaken. That list does change from time to time, and the numbers may change, but I think probably I think they'll keep it at 3 for the foreseeable future.
Probably, yeah. It used to be 5, dropped to 3. I can't see them dropping lower, but you never know.
And cards generally, not exclusively, but generally once they've gone on that list, they don't come off it.
Yeah.
But it does happen sometimes.
Yeah, as new cards come out and new uber-powered cards are discovered, or particularly cheeky combinations may be unearthed, they might end up on that list. Generally, again, follow the links in the description below for where that current list resides. It can be updated at any time, so do always check before you go to a competition.
I think that pretty much covers it for cards.
I think so.
Yeah, okay, so I hope you found that useful. Do comment below. If you did, do ask any questions if we've missed anything. And I hope you're enjoying this series and keep checking it out.
I will see you soon in the Beastgrave.
Bye.